Welcome to the Global Migration Center Lecture Series podcasts. This podcast presents Cecilia Jimenez-Damary. She is UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. Her conference is entitled Vadis, Protection and Solutions for IDPs in the Context of Migration. The conference is moderated by Professor Vincent Chetail. If you wish to keep informed about our activities, visit our website on www.graduateinstitute.ch/GMC or visit our Facebook page, Global Migration Center.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here despite many obstacles, the late hours, the long days, the coronavirus, and many other reasons which highlights that you are really interested in being here and hearing our speaker. I'm very pleased to have among us today Cecilia Jimenez-Damary, who will discuss and present protection and solution for internally displaced persons. As you, most of you know, and this is quite well known, Cecilia is Special Rapporteur of the human rights of internally displaced persons. She is also a well-known human rights lawyer with a long-standing experience, notably in NGO human rights advocacy for the Asia-Pacific region. And Cecilia was also previously acted as senior legal advisor with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center of the Norwegian Refugee Council. So, I mean, she knows a lot about internally displaced person, not only in her capacity as special rapporteur, but also because this is your field of interest since several years and decades. And I'm very pleased to have you here among us for this Global Migration Lecture Series organized by the Global Migration Center. Without any transition, I will give you the floor. Vadis, where are we going? I mean, this is a very open question, not only for IDPs. We don't know where we are going as individuals, but also as a group in this very strange period of time where, in addition to the rhetoric of crisis, the rise of populism, now we have another threat, a medical one, a health one. So, frankly, it's difficult to say where we are going, but clearly this is a perfect title for your presentation. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Vincent, and it's really my pleasure to be here. So I will stand because I'm more used to be in action. I'm not an academic, but I'm always happy to share my insights as a practitioner with students and academics, but I also see some practitioners around the room. So it's really my honor and pleasure to address you as a UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs. It's quite a long title. It's a position that's been established by the UN Human Rights Council as part of the special procedures system. We are supposed to be independent, impartial experts in the field of appointment. And I was appointed in 2016, and I have until 2022 to finish my term. It's a voluntary position. We're not getting paid for this, but as Vincent says, it's a passion and an interest, and it's been part and parcel of my advocacy for migration. So thank you, Vincent, for the invitation, and to the University of Geneva for providing me this academic platform. As scholars of migration, I guess that's you, one comes across the worlds of refugees and migrants. And I was just a while ago hearing from your students something about non-refoulement, and I said, I'm sorry, we're not talking about non-refoulement here because this is about internally displaced persons. But these two worlds of refugees and migrants are very familiar to a lot of us. And this is an approach that is mirrored by international policy making as well as by the architecture. On the other hand, a group of people on the move, like refugees and migrants, who are called internally displaced persons, are often left out of the equation of the migration spectrum. And frankly, in my view, and the view of a lot of advocates for the human rights of IDPs, it's really time to change this. For Vadis, we don't really know where we're going, but we know where we're starting, and this is where I would like to share with you. Now, over a year ago, we all know, because of the adoption of the 2 global compacts on refugees and on migrants, respectively, the increasing mobility in the world has been brought to our attention at the global stage. With these 2 global compacts, states have placed stakes and responsibilities to manage this international mobility. Although internally displaced persons had been part of the New York Declaration in 2016 that preceded these 2 global compacts, the states had actually decided to focus the global compacts only on refugees and migrants, and to manage this mobility separately. On the other hand, bringing visibility to the continuum of displacement from internal to cross-border and vice versa, and emphasizing the need for a continuum of protection and solutions for all those forcibly displaced is part and parcel of the big picture. In the latest figures, I don't know how much you know about how many internally displaced persons, but what we have is that there are more than 40 million persons internally displaced by armed conflict and violence, approximately 20 to 25 million displaced by natural hazards. That's much, much more than refugees, for example. Disaster displacement is prevalent in East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia and the Americas. And these are regions with high disaster risk because of the high levels of exposure and vulnerability. A known number of people are also displaced by development projects, land grabbing, and human rights violations. This is not estimated at all. Just the numbers alone that I have shared with you, and even the unknown numbers, they are staggering, and they remain under the radar, so to speak. Majority of those recorded as displaced by armed conflict and violence, remain in protracted displacement. That is, situations where there is no durable solution in sight. And they remain protracted displacement for an average of 20 years. That's a whole generation. And when you look at that, then you see that a lot of children are actually being raised and growing up in situations of displacement in different parts of the world. This was one reason why I dedicated my last report to the General Assembly in 2019 on the rights of internally displaced children. For those of you who are interested in this, all the UN reports are on the website. Although it is clear that international law protects internally displaced persons, as we also know, there is no sole international regime nor exclusive worldwide agency that deals with IDPs directly. IDPs remain firmly, and rightly so, at least under these circumstances, under the direct and primary responsibility of states under whose jurisdiction they are. Most of them, not all, are citizens of that state. Why do I say most of them? Because there is a minority who may be migrants or refugees in certain countries that can also be internally displaced people. And one of the recent cases that had come to my attention last year were actually refugees in Sri Lanka, recognized as such by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they were displaced because of the riots following the burning of the mosques, of the churches rather, the bombing of the churches in Sri Lanka. So, but majority are citizens of the states. Now, states, through the governments, have the primary responsibility for the prevention of arbitrary displacement, to protect these IDPs, whoever they are, and to find solutions, so long as they are within their legal jurisdictions. This, in the end, I would like to emphasize this, is what taking sovereignty seriously is all about on behalf of the people. These taking sovereignty seriously for IDPs is emphasized by the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, rather adopted by the UN in 1998. So, what makes IDPs different from refugees and migrants, bearing in mind that there are different groups of persons also who consist the spectrum of mobility, and that such mobility is a present feature of human civilization from prehistoric times to the present. The Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement provide us a descriptive definition. I'm putting an emphasis on description because it's not even legal. And what it says is IDPs are persons or group of persons who have been forced or obliged to leave, to flee or leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of the following drivers: armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, that can include gang violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. And importantly, which makes them different from refugees and migrants, they have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. Thus, the definition provides a distinct nuance of non-voluntariness of mobility. It provides probable causes and provides territorial application. It must be stressed that being an IDP does not confer on that person or persons a specific legal status, contrary to refugees. In other words, particularly where IDPs are the citizens of the country, which is majority of the case, IDPs do enjoy the same rights as any other citizens or nationals of the country of displacement. In fact, just to share with you that I myself, as a young human rights and IHL lawyer in the Philippines, started to work on this group of people now called IDPs way back in the late 1990s, when we then still called them internal refugees. Of course, that term is now passé because it's given rise to a lot of confusion, so now officially they're called IDPs. But looking back to when I started on this work and monitoring the current internal displacement situations in many countries all over the world, this descriptive definition actually gives us a very helpful clarity on the nature of the mobility that we are dealing with, and importantly, acknowledges that IDPs are within the domain of human rights, humanitarian laws, and protection. This is essential. Now, given the current situation, there are growing challenges for prevention, for protection, solutions that dictate the need for international support for national responsibility for IDPs. So it's the other way around. It's really international support for national responsibility. This is the reason that side by side with the developments and the enhancement for protection for refugees and migrants, efforts are also being likewise stepped up with regard to IDPs, and I will describe this later in the lecture. I would like to focus on three aspects related to the challenges that we have, and hopefully we'll get answers to this big question of Vadis. First of all is importance of addressing the root causes of forced displacement to support solutions. When I came on the mandate, and having worked on migration and also specifically on IDPs, I realized very early on in my career that I'm working on a manifestation of problems. the problem is not internal displacement as such. Of course, we have a lot of problems because of the situation. But at the same time, why is there internal displacement? Now, sometimes it is necessary because it's also a safety valve of people. Like there's a volcano, like in the Philippines, that erupts, and so what do? You have to evacuate, etc. But even the conditions that propel the people to evacuate and to become IDPs have to be really addressed, and so that other problems concerning protection, for example, will be prevented. So there is an importance of addressing the root causes of forced displacement so that we can actually support solutions. First of all, I would like to stress the emphasis that the respective global compacts on refugees and migration put on the need to dedicated efforts to address the root causes of displacement, to minimize, prevent the risk of it happening in the first place, and also emphasize that there must be an effective way to achieve sustainable solutions for those forcibly displaced. This is what the two global compacts say. That's part and parcel of the international management of migration. And it is clear that by addressing causes and drivers of forced displacement, member states and their partners are also contributing to addressing large refugee and migration flows. Objective 2 of the Global Compact on Migration on conditions in countries of origins for migrants is very relevant to this, as well as Objective 4 of the Global Compact for Refugees that aim to support conditions for the voluntary repatriation of the refugees in countries of origin. This can be achieved precisely through both addressing the root causes of the forced displacement and by removing obstacles to the return and reintegration of refugees where refugees are concerned. Therefore, part of the solution really is political and security cooperation, diplomacy, development, promotion and protection of human rights. They are absolutely key to preventing and avoiding conditions that might lead to displacement of persons and even eventual refugee and migrant flows. When I went to Libya, it was one of the most difficult missions I undertook, and I had interviews with a lot of IDPs. Some of them came from the eastern part of Libya, and some of them came from the south. And it was quite interesting that without prompting them, some of them were even saying that if our government does not actually address our needs as IDPs and help us find solutions for our internal displacement, we are thinking of crossing the sea. Of course, that's not always necessarily the case, but we can see that this is again part of the spectrum, and unfortunately right now we don't have the data to support a pattern that this actually happens. What we have right now are anecdotal situations. In many areas where refugees, returnees, and IDPs live side by side, like in Afghanistan, it actually constitutes a great opportunity for holistic and integrated action for solutions, particularly in support of national development plans and in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This may include support for livelihood and economic opportunities and measures to address housing, land, and property. And it is important to note, actually, at this point in time in my lecture, I'd like to mention this, there actually exists way back in 2010, the Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC, and this can be a very interesting academic issue. The IASC issued a framework then on the durable solutions for IDPs, it's a different take for the durable solutions for refugees. And this framework provides voluntary and informed settlement options. As importantly, the framework also expounds essential criteria for conditions that may be solutions to their internal displacement situations. It basically tries to answer the big question, when does internal displacement end? It's a big question because until now, nobody has really come to the fore of how that can really be addressed. What we have are settlement options and criteria. Now, the criteria, for example, safety and security, informed decision-making, documentation, etc., they are applicable both to the IDPs and to the communities that host them. Now, outside of the global compacts, because until now we're sort of trying to get inspiration not only from what the global compact said, but also with regard to existing normative frameworks. In fact, outside of these all, the Sustainable Development Goals is an interesting policy objective that mention IDPs among the populations that should not be left behind. As academics, practitioners, and policymakers, it's equally obvious to us that SDGs can be applied to IDP situations, not merely to resolve existing IDP situations, but likewise in the prevention of displacement in the very first place. Unfortunately, this is not exactly a perspective that has been really thought through, particularly by the development practitioners. And wherever I go, my last, I've been to Iraq, Ethiopia, Nigeria, all these places where if you look at the US State Department website on places where not to go, I've been there. I've been to most of those countries. But unfortunately, this is not just a security problem. There are also humanitarian and development crises in those countries. So it is important to apply the SDGs. Actually, as well, it's also very relevant to all situations where governance and rule of law SDGs are applicable to prevent, for example, conflicts and tensions from arising, or where disaster mitigation and adaptation strategies for natural hazards are applicable. Lastly, on this issue about the global compacts, that is related to the global compacts is actually the prevention of recurrence. Again, as internally displaced persons, not only do they want to find durable solutions and go back to their normal lives, they aspire that they will not be forced or obliged to move once more. Usually with hardly anything on their backs, and with their properties destroyed and their lives disrupted. Who does? I have come across IDPs who, for them, displacement has been quote-unquote normalized, not in a positive way, but basically they're so used to it that when they have to flee, it's so automatic. But this is not, obviously, the way to live. The prevention of recurrence goes back to resolving, again, the root causes of displacement, as well as ensuring guarantees of non-repetition as set by local governments and the displaced and host communities. The framework for durable solutions that I mentioned earlier, therefore, includes among its criteria access to remedies, which is a human right and which provides indirect prevention. Moreover, the framework for durable solutions describes the process of durable solutions as not only a human rights, but also humanitarian and development challenge, which is what we are mostly familiar with. But it is also a peace-building and transitional justice report. And this is why in 2017, for those of you who may be interested, my report to the General Assembly was precisely on internal displacement and transitional justice. More and more in more countries where internal displacement has been rife and continues to be rife because of armed conflict, violence, and terrorism, peace-building and transitional justice tools are being applied to internal displacement situations and to support the human rights of IDPs themselves. This is particularly with reference, for those who are interested in transitional justice theory, this is with reference to the pillars of the right to truth and as well to redress, but also, of course, the guarantee of non-recurrence. Transitional justice, unfortunately, is a concept and practice that is underappreciated when it comes to durable solutions. Again, in my view, not only because I'm a transitional justice advocate, but really based also on the field visits that I've done, it is very important to see where this can contribute to the solutions for the IDPs. So prevention, therefore, is a key challenge, from preventing arbitrary displacement, by addressing the root causes directly and indirectly, by providing solutions to current situations through durable solutions, and by preventing its recurrence. So, Vadis, so hopefully that is one way that we can actually look for the protection solutions by addressing the root causes. And the second is actually, I've discussed some of them already. The second topic I would like to elaborate on is where the global compacts are equally applicable to IDP situations. While the two global compacts eventually, compared to the New York Declaration, did not specifically focus nor even mention IDPs, the key approaches at their core are equally applicable and recognized by the international community. I'm referring particularly to the following. Government leadership and ownership were possible through a whole of government approach, again, taking sovereignty seriously. So instead of making sovereignty an obstacle to protection, to the international protection of the IDPs, sovereignty should be considered as part and parcel of that responsibility. Second, closer collaboration between humanitarian and development actors. Because it is important that this collaboration actually bring direct benefits to the IDPs as well as the host communities. And there is a need to mobilize a predictable international response consistent with national development strategies, aligned with the SDGs. This is missing in countries where there is a huge IDP population. I speak, for example, of one of the latest visits I've done, Iraq, and they have lots of donors there, but I have to say there's good response on the humanitarian side, but with regard to development, it is a problem. Same in Nigeria, same in Ethiopia. And this is the reality, that we're, again, going back to the first topic of this lecture, addressing the root causes through development. The third aspect of the global compacts, equally applicable to IDPs, is the participation of IDPs and other affected communities in relevant decision-making, including the women, persons with disabilities, and the youth. The very first report I did to the General Assembly was on IDP participation. You know, for people, particularly in the NGO sector, but that's so basic, isn't it? When you're trying to solve or contribute to solutions in certain manner, you usually have to involve the victims or the people affected. But unfortunately, the international architecture that we have now, as well as the responses of national governments, are usually top to bottom, rather than being informed, first of all, by what the people actually need. And in fact, I go further. It's not just consultations, but it's IDP participation in decisions that affect them. One of the quotes I used in my report to the General Assembly on this topic was actually a Yoruba quote. I guess there's nobody from Nigeria here. And it's classic in Africa, and saying that you cannot shave a man's head without the consent of that person being shaved. Of course, I'm not telling you to shave your heads, okay? But it's a very interesting code that really brings to the fore the involvement of the person concerned. And last but not the least is a whole of society approach based on broad multi-stakeholder partnerships, including local authorities, local actors, civil society organizations, faith-based actors, and national human rights institutions, and, if I may also add, academics. I'm not forgetting where I am. In addition, the global compacts actually emphasize a lot on improving data and supporting evidence-based responses, strengthening national data collection systems. It's very important in internal displacement. For this reason, the UN Statistical Commission actually has convened an expert group on refugee and IDP statistics. So this may also be relevant to your refugee studies. It's called EGRIS. whose work is right now in progress with many national statistical offices, and to which my mandate contributes as far as IDPs are concerned. Its main output, the result of collaboration among UN agencies, national statistical offices, and the UN Statistical Commission, was recently launched just this month in New York, last week, actually. And so we look forward to the guidance by this EGRIS to the national statistical offices so that they can generate nationally statistics on refugees and on IDPs. And it is important that statistical national offices, again, as part of the national sovereignty as responsibility, improve the state's statistical competence on data generation and analysis. All of these areas for engagement at international, regional, and national levels are essentially at the core of the continuing essentiality and implementation of constructive and enabling policies. And of course, as a special rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs, I would also like to insist that human rights is at the core of all these endeavors. The last topic that I would like to share with you is with regard to the guiding principles. And this is the 20th anniversary guiding principles plan of action that I launched in 2018. 2018 was actually the 20th anniversary of the guiding principles. And I convened a multi-stakeholder plan of action that actually includes many UN agencies, NGOs, academics, and of course a lot of the other stakeholders. But why is there an emphasis on the guiding principles on internal displacement? The guiding principles on internal displacement remain the principal framework for IDP response, protection, and solutions. The framework is the only internationally recognized framework on IDPs. It's been confirmed by the UN General Assembly again and again, and of course many national jurisdictions have adopted it as a guiding post. Now, I have to insist that the guiding principles on internal displacement as a whole is considered soft law, not binding, and therefore not binding as a collective set of principles. However, majority, if not all of the principles in the guiding principles themselves are actually based on international human rights and IHL norms, based on use slogans, like for example, the right not to be tortured, the right no form of slavery, etc. It's also based on the respective ratification of international instruments. We know the international instruments, ESC rights, civil and political rights, rights of specific groups of people, and also emerging and developing international customary law in both human rights and IHL domains. This is most especially true for monist states, so those of you who are lawyers, international lawyers, we get very excited about this, but where particularly international law is recognized as part of the law of the land in those national jurisdictions. It is important to recognize public international law developments as a basis for further elaboration in the domestication of international law through legislation, national legislation, and policy. It's a priority of my mandate. There are also likewise, I'd like to share with you some significant developments in emerging jurisprudence. When we talk about law and policy, we usually look at legislations and then the legislations coming out of the parliaments and how this is being implemented. But there is also the role of the courts. And one prime example at the international level is, of course, the jurisprudence from the International Court of the former Yugoslavia, the tribunal, which has recognized internal displacement as a crime against humanity and as a war crime in a good number of cases in favor of the petitioners. The International Criminal Court Rome Statute also includes forced or unlawful displacement within territories and in the context of non-international conflicts, among crimes for which perpetrators can be held individually liable. In at least one case, the Bosco case, again, I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I get very excited about this. In at least one case, and also the Bosco case, and more helpfully in the recently released commentaries of the ICC statutes, much elucidation was actually done based on customary law of IHL. So, Mr. Beauty is familiar with this, Michelle Beauty, who's with the Institute. And so this is something that we, again, we have taken note of. In the European setting, particularly in the European Court on Human Rights, we currently have 2 pending cases that will hopefully be resolved this year. And in the Americas, I refer you to the recent compilation of cases of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And it's very interesting, this compilation, because this really covers a lot over the decades. As importantly, because I've been talking about the international, I've been talking about regional, but there is also some national level jurisprudence that we have taken note of. There has not been very much, but there seems to be a clear leadership of certain national courts setting the way in the last decade. Colombia, anybody from Colombia here? The Constitutional Court has used tutelas as the main tool for ordering the provision of reparations for IDPs, recognizing them as victims of human rights violations. In El Salvador, the Constitutional Court just last year ordered the executive branch to recognize internal displacement as a situation that is unconstitutional. And also as not in accordance with the international human rights obligations of the country. In Mexico, just last year as well, late last year, a federal court ruled for government reparations and protection to be given in favor of a specific IDP family that had been forcibly displaced by the gang violence, the drug gangs. In Guatemala, a national court in a transitional justice case convicted perpetrators of genocide and displacement committed against a certain indigenous group in 1982 to 83. 2 years ago, a district-level court in Fukushima, Japan, ordered the continuation of disaster assistance to victims of the Fukushima disaster on the basis that they are still displaced. Yes, there are IDPs in Japan, just in case you're wondering. And that's because of Fukushima. Now, especially when you look at these decisions of national courts, the guiding principles again emphasizes, going back to my original thesis, of sovereignty entailing responsibility. And they apply in all types of situations: armed conflict, gang violence, disaster, and even transitional justice cases. And the guiding principles have really been seen to be an essential instrument for states. And last but not the least, with regard to the guiding principles, I also have to emphasize that with regard to legislation, Africa leads the way. At the regional level, we have the African Union's Kampala Convention, adopted 10 years ago. It's the only regional articulation of the guiding principles so far, and even expands on some of the principles. For example, in the Kampala Convention, it says that displacement needs to be accounted for by the state, even if the displacement occurs because of a development project that is not massive. The guiding principles, on the other hand, only says massive development projects. The Kampala Convention has actually removed that term, massive, so even small-scale development projects can be considered displacement situations when people are forced to leave. And of course, we have the Great Lakes Protocol. So I use the guiding principles in my dialogue with states, and I've had very fruitful discussions with many of the governments. And I also work closely with the RCs, the resident coordinators, as they have an essential role to ensure a comprehensive strategy to be in place to ensure effective response to IDPs. So it is important that we have in mind, as part of those protection and solutions, first of all, root causes, trying to solve that. not only in preventing displacement in the very first place, but also trying to prevent the recurrence of the situations that actually resort to forced displacement. Secondly, applying the some principles of the Global Compacts where they are appropriate. And last but not the least, using the guiding principles nationally and with the support of the international community. So, given all this, the plan of action that I launched in 2018 actually looks, just for your information, at 4 themes that are right now still the center of my mandate and many of the actions. First is law and policy, which I have, of course, shared. Second is IDP participation. Third is data. And last but not the least, solutions. So with that, I will close the lecture. And I'm sorry I sort of extended my time, but the purpose of highlighting the situation of IDPs and working to enhance their protection is not to privilege IDPs over other groups, because we have other groups, refugees and migrants. But IDPs often, and in fact, IDPs often experience the same risk as other civilians caught in conflict, for example. Yet the experience of internal displacement that do not benefit from an international regime, and also the displacement situation creates a heightened and as well distinct protection and human rights violations risk. And these particular risks have to be understood and addressed so that the rights of IDPs are protected along with those of other civilians. So that's a solution for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.